We're glad that you're here today. We're going to be talking about relationships and how important they are to building an organization and growing an organization. I want to begin by giving a definition of development. Development is the work that I've been involved in for the last 47 years and helping organizations become what they want to be and really reaching out to the world of which they're a part. And we define development as the things that we do to build what I call rational relationships with others. The whole point is that development is all about relationships. It has very little to do with money. It has very little to do with what we have to say. The realities are what we have to say is important, and oftentimes the resources that we need to do it is important as well. But the realities are if we focus specifically on what it is that we need, we're often perceived as being manipulative. Development's about relationships, and that's something that all of us can relate to. We know that we want to enjoy the presence of people in our lives, and most of us can remember an experience where we were asked about someone that we really care about and some of the qualities that specifically meaningful relationships or result in meaningful relationships. If I were to ask you, what are the things that you know, the things and the people that you know as it relates to relationships, what are the qualities of those relationships? What are the characteristics of those relationships? And most of you would say, well, we enjoy one another. We have common interests. We feel safe in a relationship because our friends recognize us for who we are, and despite the fact that we may not always be what it is we would hope to be, the realities are we still live in that relationship. But the defining characteristic of a relationship is that it's reciprocal. In other words, both parties benefit. If both parties don't benefit from a relationship, you don't have a relationship. And what you have is an arrangement. And there are a lot of organizations that have arrangements with people with whom they work. If you do the right thing and if you do it right, then we're going to make sure that you're taken care of. We'll send you Christmas cards at Christmas time. In fact, if you are really a faithful supporter, we'll probably even send you a gift or something a little bit more significant. But if you stop giving, the realities are you're probably not going to get a gift at Christmas, nor probably something else to recognize your involvement. So really what it is that we're seeking to do in the world of development is to build relationships with people. Now, the defining characteristic includes another word, and that's the word rational. In other words, these are not just relationships, but they're relationships that are really built on something substantive. One of the great analogies of development is falling in love. If you understand what it means to fall in love, then you really do understand how to go about the work of development. So let's talk a little bit more about these definitions. There are two operative words in this definition. Obviously, the word relationships, that's an important part of the definition. We are all about relationships. To the degree that we're successful in building relationships, let me assure you that you won't lack for money, nor will you lack for somebody that will listen to you. But if you seek to lead with your need at the expense of the relationship, something's going to be lost. The other word, as we've already pointed out, is the word rational. These are built on something substantive. Now, the characteristics of relationships that we just reviewed were, words, like we enjoy one another, we experience one another in wonderful ways, and we really enjoy the fulfillment of what it is that occurs as a result of that. And so we make a point of talking about the difference between relationships and arrangements. The work of development as an organization, first of all, I always want to remind people when we're talking about this, because you're all involved in building relationships. Your success in your ministry is going to be predicated on how effective you've been in building relationships. But how does that look? What does it look like? Well, I get oftentimes invited to come to organizations, and oftentimes there will be people when I walk out of the airport secure area. There's usually someone with a sign that basically says my name on it, and that makes me feel very, very secure because at least I'm in a foreign country and at least there's somebody that knows that I'm there. And oftentimes I'll go up and I'll share with them how appreciative of the fact that they are there to wait for me. And usually there'll be a conversation that will take place afterwards. And I'll say, well, why did you invite me to come, or something to that effect? And they say, well, we just don't get this development stuff. We don't get this relationship stuff. We try. I mean, our board doesn't understand it really well. Our administration doesn't understand it. And in fact, we have a development director, and I'm not sure that they understand it. We've had 15 in the last 16 years. And so they're kind of telling the story of, their situation. And so I often will say, well, that's really interesting, because it's really not all that hard. I mean, development isn't hard. I mean, we don't work hard to build relationships, or oftentimes we don't. But the whole process, at least at the ministry level, we perceive the idea of building relationships as being very, very difficult. But it's really not difficult, it's easy. And so now this person with whom I'm talking is beginning to get a bit exasperated, because he said, we asked you to come here because we don't get it. It's not easy. Well, the point is that you all have experience. All of you have experience in building relationships. And the greatest analogy of building relationships is falling in love. And so we're going to be talking about how that process, what is involved in building relationships. And I think you'll find it to be a little bit interesting as we look at the process of development. Now, here's a diagram that I call the relational continuum. I want you to introduce you to my wife. There's Sue. And that's she's lovely, as you can probably see. She's waving her hand to let you know that she's here today, and is sorry that she can't be with us. And there's Jerry, and that's Sue and Jerry before Jerry and Sue ever knew each other. You see, when people come into your organization, they don't have any understanding of who you are. They don't really clearly understand what it is that you might be asking them. But the realities are, this was Sue, this was Jerry, and there was a time that I didn't even know she existed. She lived 1,200 miles from where I was born. My father was a lobsterman. Her father was an auto worker in a company in Kenosha, Wisconsin. But there came a point in time when I finally saw her for the first time. That's the point that oftentimes you all have experienced. Think about relationships again. There was a time when you didn't know each other, but then there was a time when you saw this person for the first time. And you had all kinds of emotions, didn't you? You thought, well, maybe it was a good emotion. In some instances, it probably was. And in some instances, it wasn't perhaps all that you might have hoped for. But in my case, I saw her. She was beautiful. She had long, dark hair. She had braces on her teeth. She sparkled when she smiled. I mean, I'm thinking, this girl is really lovely. She's beautiful. She's witty. She's smart. And so we had a wonderful first exposure. At the end of that night, I asked her if she was doing something the next night. And she says, no, we could do something. And so we had a first date. And you know what first dates are like. Those were the times where we're kind of asking questions of one another. We're trying to learn a little bit more about who they are and what they're all about. And then we had, interestingly enough, a second date after that. And actually on the first date, I really wanted to make sure this was going to happen quickly, and so, or that I could continue the relationship. And so on the second date, at the end of the evening, I said, well, are you doing something tomorrow? And she said yes. Now, she didn't have to say yes. She might have said, well, I'm not sure that this is really going to go anywhere, so I don't think we probably should get together again. But she didn't say that. She invited me to come back again. And as we move down that continuum, we're beginning to understand more of each other. In the world of relationships, it's emotion that brings us together. It's rationalism that keeps us together. And always remember that. We're always drawn into relations for emotional reasons. You joined a church because you were emotionally moved at some point in time in the process that you felt that this was a place where you could really receive what it is that you were looking for. Now, in the middle of this relationship, or in the middle of this continuum, there was a time. We had lots of these arrows represent these kind of encounters that we all had as we were building a relationship, and you all remember those. There was a time when I went to see her parents and she went to see my parents. We had to meet because this was the agreement that we had both made to our future spouses, that we wanted to interview or have them interviewed by our friends, because we felt our friends really understood us probably better than even we did. And so I had to go and watch, sit into 3 different meetings with 3 different friends, to get to meet them, to get their approval or their stamp of approval that I could marry Sue. Well, there came a point in time after all of these things occurred that we were sitting in a restaurant, and I was talking to Sue, and I began to, after the meal was prepared, I began to become a little bit nervous, and I'm kind of standing there or sitting there at the table and clearing my throat and kind of getting a little bit restless. And she says, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm okay." And we went on a little bit further, and she says, "You sure you're all right?" And I said, yeah, I'm sure I'm all right. And then I finally blurted out something. What if we were to take this to the next level? Now, you remember that conversation, those of you that have been married, when all of a sudden everything changes in the relationship, doesn't it? Because in the first part of the relationship, the pronouns are predominantly I and me. But at this particular point, now it becomes we and us. We're taking some ownership of this relationship, and everything changed from that point on. Now, there were a lot of things that occurred, after that event, but the conversation was different. We were talking about, do we want to have children? Where do we want to live? What kinds of values do we have as it relates to the education of the children, if in fact we get children, and so forth? And so all those discussions were being made. But there did come a point when I asked her to marry me. But it was right about here. But by that time, she knew I was going to say yes because we had talked about all of this. And so on that particular day, this was the day that we made a commitment to one another. And this commitment essentially was that we were going to live the rest of our lives together until death do us part. Now, that's the first part of the continuum, and that's what's called, at least technically, the acquisition process. We're constantly building relationships with people, giving them more information about who we are and what it is that we do, in the hopes that they might want to come alongside, partner with us, we and us, doing things together to fulfill, what it is that we feel God's called us to do. Well, after the wedding is over, other things happen. And we call that the sustaining of a relationship. And there are really one of two options. One option is that now I'm married, now I'm going to go and be a married man. I'm going to do what new married men do. I'm going to begin the process of building resources so that we can have a home. We're going to be successful in business because that's really, really important. The things that were characteristic of what it is that happened here are not necessarily characteristic of what it is that happens here. Because the realities are, we got the girl that we wanted, now we're going to go on and live our lives, and oftentimes it's lived our lives separately. When in reality, God's provision for us is that we live together, with the Lord Jesus Christ as the center of our lives. Well, this is another part of the developmental process, and that process is sustaining. Now, in the context of organizational development, and if you want to take an interesting example of this, think of Billy Graham, for example. Billy Graham, was really, really good at this, wasn't he? He could go and people would come and he would share the gospel of Jesus with them, and then he'd leave from one crusade to another crusade, and he would do something else. And so Billy Graham was really good on the acquisition side of things. But the point is here, we need to recognize that this is also important. It's equal in its importance. And this is really maintaining the relationship. Sometimes after we're married, we don't talk as much as we used to. I remember when we were courting, we'd have all-night conversations. We'd just sit there and talk, and we'd be in restaurants, and finally they'd close the door, and they'd say, "Listen, we really want to go home, so, if you just don't mind it, we'll go home, and you can go and continue talking," and so forth. But do you talk as much now as you did during that period of time? Oftentimes not. And so there needs to be as much energy in doing this as this. Oftentimes people say, well, how do you know if you've been manipulative in a relationship? Well, if you don't put as much energy into sustaining a relationship as you did to securing it, you probably have been manipulative. And so each part of that developmental process is essential to the long-term success of a relationship. And just as it is in the context of marriage, it's the same thing in the context of running and building a ministry. We need to grow relationships. We need to sustain relationships. And together, to the extent that we do that, then there's going to be a big difference. So a couple of other just really short points here. We have a couple of acronyms that basically might be helpful in understanding. I like acronyms because I can remember them. AID, you can remember AID. And basically, during the context of building relationships, A represents, people becoming involved. We call the word attendance for lack of a better one, but people become engaged in that whole process. Then they become involved. That's what the I stands for. People become involved with one another. D stands for commitment or donation. I don't really like the acronym. It didn't fit anywhere else, and D was the best I could do, and at least you'll remember it. But in the context of building relationships with individuals, in the context of relationships between the organizations that you represent or the people that are part of that organization, you're constantly wanting to grow that ministry to the point where they do understand who it is you are, they're actually engaged in what it is that you do, and they really do make commitments or sacrifices on behalf of the relationship that you're committing yourself to. But this is another acronym, CIA, and that stands for communication. What happens after marriage, or what happens after you make that final or ultimate decision in terms of who you're going to live with for the rest of your life. Communication is really going to be important to sustaining a relationship. Involvement with one another is going to be equally as important. And appreciation. Just periodically letting the person that you care for the most in life to share with her or him how much you really appreciate their involvement in your life. Those two things assure the likelihood of a successful relationship. Now, we can talk a little bit about the work of development, and we'll just kind of use this as a conclusion. This 5-step relational developmental process involves identifying people with whom we'd like to build a relationship. We qualify people in terms of not everybody that you dated you wanted to marry. In other words, you were qualifying people internally as it relates to how relevant and relational they would be in the kind of relationship that you're hoping to achieve. You cultivate relationships. That's the courtship phase of the relational process. This is things that we all do in development as we're growing the ministry that we represent. We cultivate relationships much the same as we courted the person that we were falling in love with. And then there's a point in time where you ask people to engage themselves, to engage them with you. And that's, we call that the solicitation or the asking time, where we're actually being involved and asking them to consider becoming, the spouse that we were hoping to achieve. And then finally, we spend a great deal of effort sustaining a relationship. That's the other side of the continuum. Relationships are at the heart of successful development. You will never have a growing, successful organization apart from a generation of people who care a great deal together about what it is that you do and want to partner with you. And that's going to be the key to your developmental success.